And I want to welcome you to the 6th session of the Learning Path. And so far, everything we have discussed in these sessions applies to both face-to-face and online learning. But in this and the next session, we're going to focus more specifically on what to do when facilitating online. But before we get into the specifics of online learning, let's make sure that we remember all the important points that we learned about facilitating training, no matter where you are conducting it. So as we've done on these other days, I'd like us to begin with somebody volunteering to give us a 2-minute summary of what we learned in the last session. So can I have a volunteer? Can somebody raise their hand? And hopefully somebody that has not yet done it. So who's going to be our brave volunteer? We got one person. Who is that? Shoma, thank you. Shoma, go ahead and
yeah.
Why don't you?
Just a minute. So in the yesterday's session, we started with a question that what is the biggest challenge that we face as trainers in facility, while we are facilitating training programs. We came up with different answers, and then we learned about managing disruptive behavior. These are the quiet ones. We learned about quiet ones, know-it-all, and then clowns, busy bees, naysayers, and how to manage this. We learned through group work how to manage this. I mean, quiet ones. I mean, when we face this difficult disruptive behavior, and then handling objections, how to handle objections, and we learned about the 3 types of objections we usually we might be encountering, like reasoning, emotional, fear of change. These are the kinds, and to handle objections, we learned a tool which is LEPACT: listen, acknowledge, probe, answer, confirm, and then thanks. So through this, we would handle this person. We can handle this kind of participants. And then we learned a lot, which I was actually I was also lacking behind. It is like managing time, how to manage time properly. We learned a lot of techniques on those. And then we did some Jamboard exercises, like the best tip, which we have learned during these programs. So we came up with different tips, all of us. And then we also worked on 2 cases, one on disruptive behavior and handling objective. These were group studies, group work. And then we did the group work on 2 cases. I think that was more or less what we did yesterday.
Wow, excellent. Very good summary. Thank you so much for sharing that. You hit everything. Great job. And before we go on, I wanted to just find out, did you have any questions from yesterday? If so, go ahead and write them in the chat and we'll answer them. While you're writing, there was one question that we didn't get to yesterday, and that was the question about the relationship between the learning cycle and the learning curve. So all these terms.
Karen, I had answered that
you did?
in the WhatsApp group, but but maybe in case there is a follow-up to that, if anything is not clear, maybe you can. Otherwise, you can go ahead.
Okay. Well, if you've answered it, then I'll go ahead, unless people still want to hear. But I don't see any other questions. Does everybody feel good? Okay. All right. Well, in that case, we'll go ahead and move on to today. So in this session, we're going to discuss some basic concepts around engaging your audience when conducting online learning. And just to put this session in perspective, even though we are in our 6th session, technically, we're in the 5th module of the course. And this module takes the entire session to cover. And in this one and the next module, we're going to look specifically at online learning. we'll begin with the functionality that is most common to any web conferencing software. And these are also the easiest to manage as a facilitator. And in the next session, we discuss the more advanced functionalities for engagement. Now, some of what you're going to hear today might sound familiar, and this is pretty much because it's the same webinar that was used for the demonstrations in Module 3. But now you're going to get a chance to hear the rest of the story. Now, keep in mind that this session only covers some of the easier to use functionality that is available on every platform, or just about every platform. We'll save the more involved ones for tomorrow. But the point here is not to teach you how to use the camera or the microphone, because we know you know how to do that, but rather to think about how can you use it to get your participants involved. And we're going to answer 4 commonly asked questions that facilitators who are new to online learning typically ask. And those are, how can I get people to engage more? And so we'll look at using some of these tools to increase online engagement. And then we'll answer the question, how can I hold participants' attention? So aside from activities, what else can you do to adjust your facilitation style for online delivery? The third question is, how do I adapt in-person materials for online? And while we're not going to dive too deeply in that, because that's really an instructional design issue, we recognize that some of you are going to have to adapt, so we'll give you some tips on it. And then finally, we'll answer the question, how can I look more professional when presenting? And we'll give you some ideas about things to consider doing even before you really start to talk. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that online learning is not new. In fact, it has been used for reaching remote audiences since at least the start of the 21st century. And if you think about that, that's already 11 years ago. Actually, I take that back, it's 21 years ago. So clearly it's not all that recent. What is different though, is that the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated its rate of use exponentially. So according to a study done by one web conferencing company known as ClickMeeting, it saw a 4-fold increase in the number of webinars scheduled through its site from March 2019 to March 2020. So by March of 2021, so 1 year later, they had over 3.2 million people who had attended webinars through their platform. To put that in context, ClickMeeting represented only 2% of the web conferencing software market in 2020. So if you assume that type of increase is similar for the more well-known companies, think about how many people have become accustomed to attending or facilitating webinars in just 1 year. Well, since you are in session 6 of this course, it is safe for me to assume that at a minimum, you've attended at least 5 other live online sessions in the past. So I'm guessing that you've probably attended many more than that. So my question to you then is, think back onto all the webinars that you've attended, all the webinars, all the live online learning sessions. What are some of the most common mistakes that you have noticed trainers make when facilitating online training sessions or giving presentations? And go ahead and write your answer in the chat. What are some of the most common mistakes you've noticed? Not involving participants, says Shana. A monologue, says Shilpa. Yeah, absolutely. Motion says being unprepared. Yeah, I'll just wing it, right? A lot of you saying lecturing, going too fast, says Nicola. Yeah, that's a real common issue. I was on one yesterday and I felt that way too. Less activities, missing time schedules, really easy to do that, Praveen. Yeah, all of these activities. The lighting in the camera, says Shoma, is another issue. Yeah, these are all common mistakes. And these are some of the ones that we are going to cover in this session. So we're going to try to help you avoid making those and other mistakes. Oh, I like who was that just said that, forgetting to unmute. Kazi says, oh boy, so guilty of that. Well, to help keep you actively engaged, we're going to play a game throughout this session. So yesterday, after the last session, Serena sent you an email with 2 attachments. And one of them was called Webinar Bingo. So I'd like you right now to go ahead and pull out that handout. I hope you've printed it out, but if you haven't printed it out, then at least pull it up on your screen. And I hope you can either have a pen nearby or a pencil if you've written it out, if you've printed it out, or that you're able to use the comment function or somehow otherwise keep track of what's on here. So what you see on this webinar bingo screen is that every box is a different mistake that people tend to make when leading presentations or training on webinars. Some of these are what you have said already. Some of them are new. The way this is going to work, we're going to have a competition here. And so we're going to cover and give you tips for every one of these mistakes. As you hear us give you a tip, we'd like you to write that tip on the block. And then the goal is to try to get 5 in a row, either across or down or diagonal. Once you get 5 in a row, go ahead and type into the chat the word bingo. Right there, type bingo. And try to do it in capital letters so we see it. When that happens, we are going to temporarily pause the class and ask you to share with us the tips that you heard for each of the ones that you got in the row. So what is the mistake and what was the tip you heard? And we're going to confirm that these are tips that we said and not that you had in your head. If you are the first person to write bingo and to give us back 5 in a row that we said to you, you will get a special prize. And I'm serious, you will get something from us. So that can help. So keep that in mind as we go through this whole thing.
Karan, I missed out on something. Is it possible to repeat the main part, where exactly the row takes place?
Yeah, so the row, it can be, so it can be either a horizontal row, so going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 across, or it can be a vertical row.
But connecting down. What?
So you need to, like, for instance, if you wanted to go across, if you had a tip for not encouraging audience participation, you would write the tip there. And then if you found another one for not sharing the correct application, you would write it under the I in that first row. And so you have to have tips that you hear from us to form a row, either across or down or even diagonal. Does that make sense?
Those who played bingo, they immediately get it. I mean, in real life. So that's another thing.
Exactly. That's exactly what this is. It's just a bingo game. So
Karen, your screen seems to be zoomed in. Maybe it will help if it's zoomed out so you can actually show the rows and columns. Because I can only see 2 boxes right now.
All right.
If you can see the entire page.
Okay. Let's do it this way. Okay, so you can get either tip, 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 tip across, or tip, 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 tip down, or tip, and you can, as long as it's touching on the diagonal, that would work too. So, and you don't need to fill in the full thing, you only need to get 5. But what's going to happen is you'll probably get 2 here and 1 here. So it's going to take you pretty much a good chunk of this webinar to get through this whole game. The middle is a free space. That means that you don't have to do anything. So if you're going diagonal, you really only need to get 4, because this one counts for everyone. So if you go through the middle, you don't need to fill anything in here. And okay, let me try doing it this way. Thank you. Let's see if that helps. Am I a little bit brighter now? Yeah, okay. I don't think the problem is the camera. I think I got a light source that keeps changing as the sun comes up. It's messing up my camera. But thank you for letting me know, Stephen. Appreciate that. Okay, so are we clear on the bingo? And let me go back over here. Okay, so all right, well, let's begin with the big questions on most facilitators' mind. And that is, how can I get people to engage more? Well, there are a lot of ways, but the most important thing for you to remember is that it all starts with you. As it says at the bottom of the slide, you have to model how you want everyone else to behave. If you do not encourage participation, you're not going to get it. And if you come across as wanting people just to listen to what you are going to say, don't be surprised if that's all they do is listen, as they turn part of their attention back to reading their email or doing something else. And now, as you've already experienced in the preceding 5 sessions, this course requires a lot of participation. So think back to the first session. What did I do at the start of this learning path back in session 1? What did I do to encourage your participation? Go ahead and write your answers in the chat box. What did I do way back in session 1 to encourage your participation? Right. I got everyone to speak through an ice-breaking activity. Absolutely. Thank you, Shanaz. And Shilpa said the same thing. Absolutely. I did an activity to get them used to it. What else did I do? Right. Pick the thing nearby. That was the icebreaker. Absolutely. What else did I do other than an activity? I had you write on chat a little bit. Yeah, that's right. And what did I have you write on chat right way at the beginning? Show us how to use the tools. Absolutely. Yeah, I showed you how to use the tools so that you felt more comfortable. I got you used to your environment. And what else did I do at the beginning? I had that pre-course webinar, and that's where I showed you how to do that. I displayed messages. And I set a ground rule. I set the ground rules, right? And that very first ground rule was participate, right? All of those help say right from the start, seriously, man, I really like you to participate. Well, that's the first thing you can do. The second thing you can do, is smile when you talk. Even if your camera is turned off, smile when you talk. smiling can help you sound happier. And studies have found that when you smile as you talk, your voice sounds happier and more relaxed. And it's interesting because they've done studies where they gave the participants in the study audio clips to listen to. And they said, tell me, do you think the speaker is smiling or not? And do you know, more often than not, people were able to guess correctly who was smiling and who was not. It's very easy to distinguish. So always smile when you talk. And then, as you mentioned, conduct some type of icebreaker. Even if it only takes less than 5 minutes, conduct some sort of icebreaker activity to get the audience used to the idea of participating. And icebreakers also serve a few other important purposes. First of all, they encourage participation. Remember what we said about the hierarchy of needs. People need to feel safe. They need to feel like they belong. They need to have their self-esteem intact, right? And people are more likely to participate if they see others participating, and if they feel that the participation is not going to be too difficult. So starting with something easy increases their comfort level and sets the stage for expected levels of interaction. The icebreaker can also provide an instant audience assessment. You know, no matter how much of a needs assessment you do ahead of time, you never quite know who's in your class until they show up. So if you do an icebreaker that gives them some sort, that gives you some sort of specific information about their experience levels, then you can tailor your talk a little bit more appropriately for their needs. And thirdly, it helps to focus their attention on the topic. If you're doing an in-person class, if you think about what happens at the very beginning of the day, when people come into your class, they are not immediately thinking about facilitating live online sessions, right? They're thinking, if they've driven to the class or gotten to the class, they're thinking, oh, that traffic was terrible. Where did I park the car? What do I got to do today? What was that fight I had with my kids? Anything. They're thinking about everything except what you want them to be thinking about. And if it's an online session, the problem is even worse. Because if you think about how the world worked 1 year ago, maybe 14 months ago at this point, you know, if you went from one meeting to the next, you had the time it took you to walk from one conference room down the hall to the other conference room to clear your head and refocus your thinking. But now we click out of one meeting, we click onto another, and you've got about 2 seconds. So when people join, most of the time their head is not really with you. Their head is on the previous meeting. So doing an icebreaker helps you to focus their attention on what you want to talk about. And for webinars, an icebreaker serves a fourth useful purpose, and that is it helps familiarize participants with the tools. So if you are planning on using some of the functionality to engage participants, like the response emoticon, then the icebreaker is a good opportunity to teach them where is that button, where is that functionality, before you get too deep in the content and now have to stop the content to explain it to them. Relatedly, only use functionality in the icebreaker that you will use later in the session. So if you're not going to use annotation anywhere else in the session, do not use it here. Don't waste time teaching them functionality that they're never going to use again. Now, many of you might be wondering, what should I do as an icebreaker? So here are some tips. First of all, these sites listed here and included in the summary sheet that you get after today's session contain some ideas for icebreakers. There's a lot of great ideas here, but even if you don't use those ideas directly, it might spark an idea that you could develop into something relevant. And if you don't like any of those, you can always Google virtual icebreakers for adult training. And I highly recommend you put in the word adult, because otherwise you get icebreakers that are good for children. Whatever you decide to do, keep your icebreakers easy and quick. Usually just give a single question that they can answer either by chatting or by speaking if the groups are small enough. And if you ask a question, try to keep it somehow related to the topic at hand so that it starts to bring the focus to the topic of the discussion. And that's really one of the big differences between like an opening activity / icebreaker and an energizer. An energizer is just meant to shake you up and get you some energy going. But an icebreaker and an opening activity are meant to help focus your attention in a very easy way, kind of like a toe in the water, so to whatever the topic is that you're going to be discussing. You can also use, you can also use poll questions to get a sense of who is in the audience by asking a series of closed answer questions. And we'll talk about that more in a little while. But as you can see, icebreakers set the tone for the level of engagement. Let's now talk about ways to keep participants engaged after the icebreaker. And we'll start with one.
Karen, there is a question from Ahmed. What is the difference between icebreaker and energizer?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. I think the icebreaker is more focused on getting you focused on the topic. It's relevant to the training. Whereas an energizer just shakes up your blood and wakes you up. Thank you, Rohit. So let's start with one of the most obvious tools you can use to engage people, and that is the microphone. Now, clearly we've all used the microphone here. So I'd like to ask you, using the microphone, what are some of the benefits of asking participants to talk with the microphone during a webinar? Feel free to open your mic and share your thoughts. Okay, it's quick, says Lily. Shilpa says it makes it easier, clarity of the question or the expression. Right, it's better for longer answers, absolutely. Anybody else have a thought? Mohsin, your mic is open. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, it saves time.
It saves time, right? You don't have to wait for everybody to type it. And anybody else want to say anything? Some love to talk. Assad?
Yeah, it's a confirmation that the person you're talking to is actually there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Great answers. You've identified both in the microphone and in the chat many of the benefits that there are to using the microphone. So to summarize, and it's like a hook Shanaz says, it keeps everyone focused because you're hearing a different voice. So it brings back people's attention. The microphones are best used for more in-depth discussions or when there are 6 or fewer people on the call. But if you have more than 6 people on the call, it's a best practice to have everyone mute themselves when they are not talking. And this solves several problems, including that it filters out background noise and it reduces the chance of participants talking at the same time. Now, you are a particularly good group because nobody stepped on each other. You all managed to figure out how to talk and wait your turn. But I can't tell you how many webinars I've been in, or even just web calls where it's the old, you go, oh, well, you go, oh, no, you go, that issue, right? So if you have everybody muted, you avoid all of that. And using the microphone and having them muted also reduces the likelihood of side conversations. And here, this is one way that I think actually online learning has a benefit over in class, because in class you get all those little sideline conversations that you have to manage with your difficult participants, your talkers and your class clowns. And here you can just mute them. Wouldn't it be great if you could just mute those people in a real class? And I should mention that as a general caution, the microphone, like every other tool I'm going to discuss in this session, is located in a slightly different place depending on what software you're using and whether the participant is joining via the phone, via the tablet, or via the computer. And it depends also whether you are in the presenter mode or in the participant mode. So one thing I would suggest is before you give your presentation, get onto the actual software you're going to be using. Get on from 3 different types of devices if you can. Look at it from different perspectives so that you can direct people appropriately and say, oh, if you're on the phone, tap the middle of your screen and slide to the left. If you're on your computer, look at the bottom, right? Because it's different for all of them. While questions are an excellent way to keep people focused on the session, it's best to use those participant microphones sparingly if it's bigger than 6 people in your group. An easier way to control the flow of conversation is by using the chat function. And clearly you've already used that quite a bit in this program. So let me draw on your experiences and ask you to write into the chat, what are some of the benefits of asking participants to use the chat function? Shilpa says it's saving of time. Louis says more people can answer at the same time, right? You get active participation. Mosin says you can get multiple answers. Praveen makes a really good point that the quiet people can feel more comfortable to speak. And Shital brings up that it doesn't disturb the flow of the speaker. Absolutely, you've identified some great benefits of these. For short answer questions, that chat function is an excellent alternative. And you can use questions as ways to get participants' attention as you start talking about a new topic as part of your gloss. You can also use short answer questions as a way to check understanding during ease, or to get participants to think about how they would apply what they just learned, either during your ease or your off. And you can use it even to just check if they are with you, right? Does everybody have page 5 open? Type yes if that's the case. If you are going to use the chat function, remember to keep your chat box open on a corner of the screen so that you can see the responses, but so that it does not interfere too much with your slides. Now that seems kind of obvious, but on most software, the chat function does not open automatically. So it's very easy to get to the point where you go, okay, type your answers in chat. And you go, oh my gosh, where's my chat, right? Open it up, put it to the side so you can see it, but it doesn't cover what you need to look at too much. Now, one of the big differences between asking a question in person and asking online is that it takes longer to get a response online. So if you think about what happens in the classroom, I ask you a question, you hear the question, you think about it, and then the answer comes out your mouth. But online, I ask the question, you hear the question, you think about it, but then you have to, if you haven't been so good, you have to toggle back to the webinar. In any case, you have to grab your mouse, you got to click into the chat box, you got to type your answer, hit enter, it's got to travel all the way across the internet. I have to see it, read it, and then say it out loud. So all of that is seconds, but those seconds add up. And there's a funny thing that happens when you are the speaker. When you are talking, time goes so quickly. But as soon as you have to be quiet up in the front of the room, time goes so slowly. And it feels like eternity. And so a lot of facilitators, even in the class, they make the mistake of not giving people enough time to think. So they'll say, well, what is 1 plus 1? Well, I'll tell you, it's 2, right? Instead of giving them that silence. So we always tell people, if you're in the classroom, after you ask a question, count to 10 in your head slowly. Usually by about 5 to 7 seconds, somebody will answer for you. Online, you have to double that. So count to about 20, and usually by about 15, somebody will start to type in the answers. Now, when the responses start to come, remember to read the comment out loud and mention who wrote it, so that you're acknowledging their contribution and making them feel like part of the conversation. So you read 1 or 2 of these, and reading the answer also helps to eat up a little bit of that dead air until other people can finish typing. And then all of a sudden, the rest of the answers start coming and they go zooming across your screen. And it's almost hard to read them. Well, don't worry, you don't have to read them all. Pick about 2 to 4 good ones and then comment on them and then move on. Now, for simple closed-ended questions, most web conferencing software has an even quicker tool that you can use, and that is the response emoticons. Again, depending on your software, these can look different. It can be the raise hand icon. It can be the green check mark or the red X. But these response emoticons provide a quick and easy way to interact with the audience and get a little nonverbal feedback. Just as with the chat function, it takes a moment or 2 longer to get a response online as people search for the buttons. And you can also use these emoticons to conduct quick polls. So for example, you could say, raise your hand if you have a website for your company. Or you could even do it as, does your business have a website? Click the check mark for yes, click the X box for no, or the X mark for no. As you ask questions for emoticon response, remind participants where they can find the button. Again, it's different in every software. That also gives you something to say while they're entering their answers. So let's try this right now. How many of you have used response emoticons in sessions that you have facilitated online before? Raise your hand if the answer is yes. All right, see. Good. I see about 5 or 6 of you have. A couple more now. Yeah, we're up to about 10. Good. So at least half the class has used it. This is a great technique to keep people engaged. And you can even use it to say, you know, do you understand? Raise your hand if you have a question, or click the green check if you understand. And every time you ask them these questions, it forces them to do something which brings their attention back to you and to doing something. But notice how quickly that was for me to do that little activity. It got you involved, but it was so quick, I didn't even make a full activity out of it. It engages without taking too much time. Well, so far, we've talked about using auditory techniques, mainly questions and answers, to keep audiences engaged, but visuals can help too. Most people prefer to see as well as hear when they learn, and screen sharing enables you to address that learning need. You can use screen sharing to show slide presentations just like you do in an actual class and just like I am doing now. If you are going to share your screen, make sure that before you share, you have closed out of any other applications that you do not want others to see, such as your email, your calendar, your financial records, your Facebook account. Get out of it all, because sometimes when you share, the screen that you think you are sharing is not always the screen that first pops up, and you don't want to embarrass yourself by, or even worse, show your bank account number to everyone. Some systems do sharing differently. Some allow you to share your whole screen. Some allow you to share a portion of your screen. Some allow you to share an application. So if you have two PowerPoint files open, you can toggle between them and they will both show whatever's on top. And others make you share one file at a time. So make sure you understand how it works on your system, especially if you have something like you have your PowerPoint up and then you click on a link and it brings you to a video. Remember, you might need to share that video separately. Otherwise, you're going to see the video and go, isn't this great? But your participants are still looking at your PowerPoint. Now, another big issue that happens with slides is, what do you do with your notes? And there's a lot of options for that. And my favorite, though, is that in some web conferencing software, you can use the presenter mode so that you can see the speaker's notes while the audience sees only your slides. And I'm going to show you now what I mean. So this is one of those backstage moments here. So I'm going to show you this. Yeah. So now you can see, you as the participants, you see the slide, but I can see my notes here and read right off. And you can move this little toolbar this way and that way. And what I like to do is have it so that I can see what's on the slide, and the notes are right under my camera. So my eye is kind of looking in the direction of the camera, even as I'm reading. So how do you do this? Well, if you're in Windows, as it says here, press the Alt key and the F5 key on the keyboard. If you are using Mac, follow the menu path, Slideshow, Presenter View. Now, again, this works differently on different softwares, and I'm going to go back to hiding this for a second. Well, I won't. I'll let you hang here, giving you the backstage look here. If you are in Teams, when you click Share Screen, what your audience is going to see is just the screen. But you can then toggle over and see this whole thing. And every time you switch, they'll only see the slide, but you'll see both. For Zoom, it works a little bit differently. And the best way to show you this is to have you follow along a little bit, because this is a little bit tricky. So if you go into your share screen button, which you know is at the bottom, when you look at Zoom, what first comes up is that you see all the different applications you have open on your screen. And up at the top, there's three little words: basic, advanced, and files. Normally you come up in basic. If you click on advanced, there's one called portion of screen. And if you click that and then click the share, and please don't hit share just yet, what'll happen is it'll bring up a green box. And that green box, you can then adjust to wherever you want. So you can put it right around that little smaller slide that you have. And whatever's inside that green box is what shows. So now you are seeing my slide, but I can still see my notes. Oh, we got some bingos already. Okay. And let me just say one other thing, and then we'll get to our bingo. So the other point I just wanted to make about that share screen is that if you're using WebEx, it doesn't work. You can't do that on WebEx. So let's stop for 1 second before I move on to the next slide. And I see Hong had bingo first. So Hong, you want to share with us, why don't you share with us your card and what the tips were that you heard? If you want, you can share the slide, share the screen or the camera.
I just take note in my notebook. I can tell quickly. From the left-hand side top, not encouraging audience participation. Actually, we hear a lot of tips from you. Like you have to model, you have to show the tool, you have to organize activities. And then I move on to the one talking for too long. The tip is we can talk just 1 or 2 key points. And I move down to not focusing the audience attention. We can have, I have 2 tips. One is to use icebreakers, and another is to use poll questions. And the last one is looking down at notes. Your tip is to use the presenter mode.
Very good. Let's give her a round of applause. Congratulations. Yay.
Everyone, please give me the emoji.
Yeah.
Please give me the emoji, hand claps.
Oh, they're coming up there. 9, 8, yes. Great. Well, congratulations, Hong. And because you were the very first person, you get a prize. And that prize is, we are going to send you, after this session, your very own copy of the IFC's new guide to training, and we will send it directly to your email. And this has all kinds of information about how to, best practices for doing training, all phases of the training life cycle in emerging markets. So it's great for you. So that, look that in your email.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. So I'm going to go back here into sharing my slides again. Yay, congratulations. And the rest of you, you can still keep using that to keep track of tips just because you didn't get it. And a close shout out to Kazi, who also had bingo, but wasn't quite as quick on the draw, on the typing.
I was waiting for your sentences to finish, and my God, I should have done it early.
Darn it, that's what you get for being polite. And yeah, Assad, quite frankly, I appreciate what you're saying, but I wouldn't go to Rio right about these days. They're really having a COVID problem. All right, well, let's get back into this here. Well, another basic tool for visual learners is the camera. All right. If you really want everyone to see you and you to see everyone's nonverbal cues, consider using the camera. Using the camera, as many of you have said, when you're the speaker, can make the presentation feel much more personal and engaging. And it makes it easier for participants to feel connected to you. So I do not dispute that with anybody who's mentioned that over the past couple of sessions. And similarly, seeing others' reactions can give you back some of the visual cues that you have when you are face-to-face. Most web conferencing software enables you to see thumbnail versions of all participants during the call, and that can help you monitor their reactions. But the problem is that if you start having a lot of people, even like 20 people, it's hard to see everybody in those thumbnails. And even if you see them, they're very small, so it's very hard to pick up, a squinting face. And you often have to like shift to the next page of pictures, so it kind of becomes a little cumbersome. More importantly, though, a big disadvantage of the cameras is that they use a lot of bandwidth, and that can slow the transmission. So if you know that either you or the people who are going to be on your call are in areas where with intermittent or weak internet, consider not using the camera. The other big disadvantage to leaving the camera on while presenting is that it makes it harder for you to refer to your notes. So even if you are reading the notes from your computer screen, your eye does not look necessarily like you're looking at the audience. So it's a little bit tricky. You have to lift up your computer, but your camera is always above where you're looking. So if you're not fortunate enough to have a teleprompter, you have a couple of other options you can try. First, you can try printing your notes single-sided and then lean them on your computer screen directly under the camera. Because they are single-sided, you can slide them out when you are done with them rather than having to flip them, so people don't need to see that you're moving the paper. You could also use that F5 button, that presenter view, if your software will allow for it. Or you can memorize or near memorize your presentation, which, sometimes that's great, especially if it's something you've created. It's kind of in here anyway, and it really works beautifully. But if you're teaching a class that somebody else has created or that has a ton of information, it's a lot of work to memorize it all. In
Karen, I
addition,
think Shanaz has a question. She's had a hand up for a while.
Shanaz, go ahead. Shanaz?
I'm sorry,
Okay.
I forgot to lower it.
Ah, okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
No worries. All right. So one issue with the camera on is the notes. The other is that you have a lot of other things you're doing. You might be taking notes or looking at things, checking your clock, having to flip. Maybe you want to grab a drink of water. Maybe you need to blow your nose. Could be any one of these. So there's a lot going on that makes it hard, because when your camera's on, you really need to be in line of that. I can't really do that so easily, or you lose me. So it's become a best practice that you just show your face during the introductions. If you're using a PowerPoint slide, you show the slides and you turn on without the camera on, and then you turn on the camera for the Q&A parts or the conclusion, or if there's a meaningful moment where having that camera on actually enhances or adds to your explanation. Think of the other day when I was talking about congruence, and I said, if you say, oh, that's interesting, right? That was a lot easier to show you with the camera on, and it added to it. So that is the best practice at the moment. Well, I've given you a few tips for visual functionality, and I'm guessing that most of you have already used screen sharing and cameras in your meetings. So let's share some lessons learned. So right now, I'd like you to write into the chat, what is your favorite tip or lesson that you have learned from experience about either screen sharing or using cameras in web meetings? Go ahead and write it in the chat. What is your favorite tip that you've learned over the past year or so on using screen sharing or web cameras? Role plays by camera, in person only. Kazi, can you open your mic and explain that one a little bit more?
Sorry, typed too fast. When I do role plays, I ask the two of them to keep their video on, their camera on. The rest of us go zoom out.
Ah, okay.
That's
a great idea. That way you can focus on.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Shilpa says, share a backup with someone beforehand for screen sharing. Such a good idea. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been on where let me share my screen. We can't see it. It's frozen. And then somebody else has to take over. Close unnecessary apps, absolutely. Use two screens, one for Zoom and another for the screen I share. So Hong, I'm going to ask you to open your microphone for a second here. When you have the two screens open, where do you have them placed? Do you have them side by side or in front or in back of each other? How do you place those screens?
I have the laptop screen and the TV screen. So the TV screen must be behind the laptop because it's big. And when I use two screens, it's easier for me to manage the file that I'm going to share because I can look at the two screens at the same time. Yeah, and especially for me, my eyes is not good. My eyesight are not very good, so it's helpful. Yeah.
And so the camera is on your computer, not on the TV. So so you have the notes showing on the one on your computer or on the TV?
Normally I show the note on the TV and the webcam is on my computer. So I watch everyone on my computer. Because normally in my class, I ask everyone to open the camera if the internet bandwidth is is good. Then I ask them to open the camera and I look at them in my computer. It's one way it's one way to motivate myself. You know, when I see people face to face, it's easier for me to talk. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I understand that. It's very hard talking to a black screen or to a wall. Stephen says, use two computers. It's kind of the same thing. One as your main machine for training, one where you log in as a participant to check everything is working. Oh, right. That way you can verify a poll is visible and how your screen sharing appears for the participants. Actually, that's right. And that's a slightly different twist than what Hong was saying, which is have one open in participant view and have the other one open in presenter view. So even when you want to direct them and say, okay, here's where that button is, you can look over there and see it. Great tips. Yeah, I do that too. It really does help quite a bit. All right, well, we're at the 1 hour mark. So this is a good spot here. Let's take a break. And when we come back, we're going to move on to the next question. Okay, so I've got 1 after, so let's come back at 6 after or 36, depending on your time. Okay, see you in a few minutes. Okay, we're going to get started now. I hope everybody is back. I've got 5 minutes. Well, we were talking just before the break about these great ideas for visual sharing, and thank you for submitting so many good ideas. That was really informative. Well, if you're now thinking that managing the microphones and the camera and the chats and the emoticons while you're trying to remember what you're going to say and pay attention to what people are asking and thinking of these great responses and looking at the time, if all of that seems like too much, you're right, it is. It's too much to do all on your own. That's why we recommend that you always get a co-host. The co-host manages the more technical aspects and lets you focus on the discussion. The larger your class size, the more important it is to have a co-host. Once you identify your co-host, and in my case today, for instance, it's Rohit, take the time before the session to discuss roles and responsibilities so that there's no doubt about who is doing what. Consider asking your co-host to help you admit participants to the session, especially if you're using a waiting room. You don't have to always be the one admitting people. And especially if people drop in the middle and come back in, it's nice to have somebody else who's worrying about that. Your co-host can also read responses on chat, especially if you have a bigger group where it's hard to see everything. Both you and your co-host can keep scanning it. And a lot of times also what happens is when you start talking and people write comments, you're not looking at your chat. And so there may be a question. And so your co-host can do like Rohit has done and say, hey, wait, there's a question here. Let's catch that. Your host can also mute, your co-host rather, can also mute and unmute the microphones. And this is also something that I think is much better than in the classroom. So if you have somebody who's talking or whose mic is on and you hear the dogs barking in the background, you don't have to be that person that goes, well, everyone please mute your microphone, right? You don't have to be that person. You can just have your host go over to their name and hit the mute button and it's all taken care of and you don't have to say anything. Your co-host can also clear the emoticons and clear the annotations so that, you don't see a hand and think that it's raised. Also, if there's any troubleshooting that needs to happen, if somebody can't hear, they can't find something, the co-host can deal with that on the side. And the other big thing that the co-host can do is help you keep time. Ask them to send you a private chat when you're halfway through your session, and then again when you're about 20 minutes before the end of the session. And I say 20 minutes because that then gives you 10 minutes to wrap up and leaves you about 10 minutes for a Q&A session. Or if you really need more time, 5 minutes for the Q&A session, but it gives you a little flexibility. Make sure if you're going to use a co-host that you have given co-hosting privileges. In some software, you have to do that before you open the session. It's a setting on the web version of it. So make sure that you check that out ahead of time. Well, now that you know some of the easier and more common functions that exist for engaging participants, let's address the next big question.
Karen, there is a question from Sheetal. How important is it for the co-host to know the teaching content?
It's helpful, but it's not critical. As long as they understand when they need to do things, then that's the most important thing. It helps if they have a little bit of the knowledge just because they can sometimes add additional color, but it's not required. Thank you. It's more important that they know how to use the web conferencing software. So those features that I mentioned can help you make your training more engaging by helping you think of activities that you can do with your participants. But even if you're not doing formal activities, the way you communicate can help keep your participants in attention. So in 2018, Prezi, which is the alternative to PowerPoint, and Kelton Global Consulting Firm conducted a study of what keeps listeners in webinars interested. And what do you think respondents said were the best ways to keep their attention? Now, I don't need you to answer this to me just yet, but just think of it in your head for a moment. Well, according to the survey, 55% of respondents felt that a good story helps keep them engaged. And right behind that was stimulating dialogue and visual stimulation. And I have to clarify that visual stimulation does not mean just a pretty picture of a flower. It means two things. One, that what is happening on the screen changes frequently so that participants have something new to view. And two, that what they're viewing enhances what you're talking about. So it helps improve and is related to the understanding of what you're discussing. So let's look at how you can build these into your facilitation, starting with the top reference, which is stories. Now, it does not surprise me at all that storytelling came in as the top choice. Storytelling is one of the oldest instructional methods around, dating back to the times when histories were passed down orally. It works because the drama ties information together in a meaningful way, rather than just being a set of dry facts. When you tell a story, tell one that relates to the content, not one that is just funny or interesting. And you have a choice in how you tell a story. The first option is you can start at the beginning and go to the end. And when you do this, you create a curiosity gap. A curiosity gap is this gap in our knowledge that makes us curious enough to want to hang around and listen so that we can close that gap. So imagine that this was a course on customer service. I might tell a story that goes something like this. A number of years ago, our bank was losing customers. We did a survey and discovered that even though our interest rates were higher than our competitors, people preferred to bank elsewhere because we had such poor customer service. So to fix the solution, we conducted a survey, provided more training based on the results, blah, blah, blah. And now we have the highest customer retention of all banks in the country. Our customer satisfaction ratings on bank review websites is a perfect 5. Now here, the curiosity gap is, well, what is the result? How did you fix that problem, right? And you hang around long enough to find the answer. But while this is straightforward, I'll admit that frankly, it's a little bit boring. So an alternative is you can start from the end and work your way back to the beginning. And now the curiosity gap becomes, well, how did this happen? So for example, for that exact same story in that exact same course, I could have told it this way. Our bank is renowned for its customer service. You have probably heard that we are the only bank that routinely gets perfect 5 scores for its customer satisfaction ratings on bank review websites. This was not always the case. What do you think we did to turn around our scores? And then the facilitator could take a few guesses from the audience and then use that as a springboard into the whole story. In this form of backward storytelling, the participants are more likely to pay attention because they want to see if they are right. It's that, what I call that murder mystery approach to storytelling. If you think about any good murder mystery that you've seen or read, it always begins with a dead body, right? And the big question, that big curiosity gap is, who done it? And you hang around to either find out the answer or to see if you are right. Now, remember that storytelling does not need to be a one-way talk. Remember that dialogue came in second, and at the heart of dialogue is two-way communications. And one way we do that during webinars is to ask questions. Trivia questions are a great way to get participants' attention during the gloss part. And you can use this every time throughout the webinar that you change topics practically because people love trivia and statistics. And if you did this almost every time you change topics, most likely your audience would not get too bored. In addition to getting their attention, you can use trivia questions or statistics throughout as a way to add credibility or to emphasize a point that you're trying to make. Now, in my case, in this section, I gave you the answers right away, but you could also delay the answers until the end of the topic or the end of the lesson to heighten the drama. So I could have said, you know, what do you think were the top 3 ways to keep people's attention? And then given you a lot of the background information, and then come back and say, now that you've heard this, what do you think are the top 3 ways? And have you write in your answer and then tell you. And this way you keep people a little bit engaged in a different way. Well, if you can't find a good storyteller, a good story to tell, or do not want to use a lot of trivia throughout your presentation, try using some sort of list to help organize the content. Lists are like mileposts along the route of information. They let the participants know how much ground they have and how much more they have to go. So for example, in this webinar, what creates a story is the answer to the 4 big questions that facilitators ask. In essence, the list is the story, but it's much more interesting than just reading through a list of dry facts. And any of the things you see on the screen right now make good lists. But beyond the course content, how you speak can directly impact participants' level of interest. Now here we're not talking so much about what words you choose, but more how the words come out your mouth. Varying your tone, your pitch, and your volume is always important when presenting. It is even more important when presenting online because it's harder to see the presenter online. So here are some tips to help you with vocal quality. First of all, stand when you talk. When you sit, you compress your diaphragm, which is the muscle between your lungs and your stomach. And it's where you hold your air when you speak. When you sit, you contract that like a balloon. And so you can't get in a full breath of air. When you stand, you have the full use of that balloon, and it's easier to control how much air comes out at a time. Standing also gives you more of an outlet for nervous energy. It's easier to use your hands and your arms, especially online compared to in the classroom, because in the classroom, you know, if you're just doing this a lot as you talk, that gets annoying. But online, as long as your hands are below the camera, you can do that as much as you want to get out that nervous energy, and nobody's going to see it. And getting that out will make you sound more relaxed and at the same time, more energized. The second tip is to pause for impact. Most people talk an average of 150 words per minute. However, most listeners who are trying to think about the information usually only hear at about half that rate. So pausing after stating a key point can give your participants some time to consider what you have said. And a little longer pause can emphasize your point. Now you have to be careful not to overuse this technique, or you will lose time, or worse, come across as sounding like you do not know what you want to say. When you pause, pause silently. Avoid filler words. Thirdly, mirror your emotion with volume and speed. The speed and the volume at which you talk can substitute for body language or facial expressions to a degree when you don't have your camera on and you cannot show your emotions. So, for instance, when you're talking about a shocking event, increase the volume in order to capture the audience's attention. And as for stories that are emotional or sad, the volume should decrease and take a softer tone. And if you're trying to show excitement, talk a little bit faster. And if you're trying to convey boredom, talk a little slower. So you see how that affects the emotion. And finally, my favorite tip of all, talk to a picture. You know, especially at the very beginning, when you're not comfortable with webinars, it can feel very awkward to talk to a blank screen or to a wall. And because of that, we tend to become a little less dynamic in our talking. So one thing you can do is before the session, go find a picture of somebody you love and print it out and then paste it or tape it right above your camera. And as you talk, just keep looking at that person you love. And because you love this person, you just kind of can't help but smile. And now your eyes are looking up, not down, and you're smiling, which makes you sound better. Well, that's a lot of information. So let's pause for a moment and process. I think there were a couple of questions. If you have a question about what I've talked about just now, go ahead and ask it. And Rohit, were there any?
Yes, there were some comments in the chat box. Praveen was mentioning that the storytelling, you're talking about the front, back, end to beginning was like flashback in
That's
movies.
correct. Exactly.
And Hong had a observation that it is difficult to stand and manage the computer.
Yeah, so if you're going to stand, you have to lift your computer. So I have what's called a flexible desk, and you can put this on top of your desk and you can put it down, so it's like a sitting desk, or you can lift it up and it's like a standing desk. So if you do that, it becomes a lot easier to manage the computer.
And Shanaz has her first bingo.
Ah, congratulations, Shanaz. A little bit late for the game, but that's good. I'm glad you finally got it. Thank you. And now she has two of them. Fantastic. Well, let's now move on to the next big question, which is how do I convert classroom material for online presentation? Many people think you can just take your face-to-face material and share it on the screen and you're good to go. But in reality, the differences between face-to-face and online facilitation mean that you're going to need to to the material. First and foremost, keep it short. The absolute longest you should make any webinar is 2 hours. People do not have the attention span for more than that. And the shorter you can go, the better. If you are using any form of interaction with your participants, keep in mind that it's going to take longer online because they need more time to find the buttons and click and type. So a good rule of thumb for a single session webinar, not like today, this is part of a live online, but for a single session webinar is that it takes about 25% longer online to accommodate those delays in getting responses. So if you have an interactive presentation that you know takes you an hour to do live, it's likely going to take you an hour and 15 minutes to do it online. So that means you cannot cover as much content as you could in person. So see if you can remove about 25% of what you want to say. So to do that, one thing you can try to do is to discuss only the 90%. The 90% of the information that they need to do their job 90% of the time. So that means don't talk about the whole history of the project, don't talk about a ton of theory, don't talk about every exception. Just give them what they need to do their job 90% of the time. For the more advanced information, you can hold a separate session. For alternatives, you can show that to them, afterwards. Same thing with exceptions. Also, try not to talk for more than 5 minutes before involving participants in some way, even if it is just a question or even just changing the image on the screen. Now, notice that we recommend talking for no more than 5 minutes per slide. The more the image changes, the more participants stay focused on the screen. If you talk for 15 minutes on a single slide, participants realize they don't need to look at the screen. They can just listen and get as much out of it. So if you don't want to have a very fat slide deck, you can use animation or builds like I'm doing now. This is all on one slide, but it still changes every couple of minutes. As you create your slide, remember that participants might be viewing the session on a tablet or a smartphone, and that means that they have smaller screens and cannot see as much or as well. So remember to use more images and less text. And if you're going to use text, make sure that the minimum size is 18 so that it's readable on any size screen. Finally, give a lot of thought to what you're going to say. The goal is to be short, clear, and crisp in your talk. That gets the message across better and helps you stay on target for time and content. So now let's turn to what you can do to make life easier for yourself and at the same time come across as looking like a polished facilitator. So this section discusses what you need to do to prepare for a successful webinar. And it looks at some additional considerations during times like this pandemic or other emergency or disaster situations. And let's take this one step at a time. The first is to determine what is the purpose of your meeting. And in general, web meetings come in 3 varieties. Working meetings are usually with a small group of team members, and the goal is to make decisions, to create deliverables, or to get status updates. And for this, two-way communication, and especially using the camera, is really important. Presentations are less about decision-making and less about two-way communication than they are about just informing listeners of new information. And in these cases, interactivity can help keep listeners focused on the meeting, but it is not essential. Most webinars that you watch are presentations. They're really just giving you information. Training sessions are different. Their goal is to actively engage participants in the learning process so that they leave with new skills, knowledge, behaviors, or attitudes. And in this case, interactivity is critical to success because, as the saying goes, you cannot learn for someone else. Learning is something that the participants need to do for themselves. So ideally, these sessions should be smaller in participant size because they are more interactive. Once you start getting above like 20, 25 participants, it makes it much harder to control the interactivity. Now, you can have interactivity with 50 to 75 participants per session, but you have to reduce it and give more group things and less individual attention. Depending on the purpose, different web conferencing software may be more appropriate. So the columns here are organized by the amount of features and functionality that the web conferencing software has. So those in the left column have the most features and are appropriate for any type of meeting. And I should say these are not the only web conferencing software out there. It's just some of the most popular ones. The further you get to the right, the less functionality they have. And so by the time you get to live streaming, that's really only good for information sharing because there the chat, it's outside of what the presenter sees. And usually the participants are only really using it to say, yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, haha, great job, keep it up. So it's hard to have that meaningful conversation on a live stream. Well, once you've identified an appropriate software, you next need to organize the actual event. We recommend you send the invitations 1 to 3 weeks ahead of time because we've noticed that more than 3 weeks, people forget about it. even if it's on their calendar. And if it's less than a week, given how many meetings everybody is having, it's hard to find time. For larger audiences, it's now considered a best practice to send the link, the dial-in number, and the password to the webinar in a separate reminder that arrives 1 hour to 1 day before the event. This helps prevent uninvited people from hacking into this session. And always set a password for your conference so that you don't have anybody unintended join the call. This is particularly important if you are having large numbers of participants on the call. And then consider whether you want to have read-ahead materials in the invitation. It really depends on the situation. Giving read-aheads can help generate interest in the call and make it possible for people with bandwidth issues or who can only join by telephone to follow along. However, if the only handouts you have are summaries of the main points of the call, it's better to wait and send that afterwards to participants who actually attended. Otherwise, there's no point in them attending the call.
Karen, there are some questions. I think Ezra has a question. She has her hand raised, and there are some questions in the chat as well.
Okay, go ahead, Ezra.
I want to ask if there is a requirement for interpretation, because I had a very terrible experience with, I think the tools for that enable interpreters is different. So can you just give some information on these kind of tools as well?
That's a very good question. Some of, like, I know WebEx and I think Zoom has an option for closed captioning. And I know that's not interpretation, but my point is that I'm not too impressed with them. They get words confused all the time. So I think what you can do, and what I've seen done, is you can, in Zoom, they call it pinning. I don't know what they call it. I think it's called spotlighting in some of the other ones. But you can split your screen and have you talking on one side and have somebody else visible in the second one, second presenter. And so if you needed to have potentially, oh, thank you. If you needed to have like a sign language interpreter, you could have that person be visible the whole time. Rohit, do you have any experience with any tips for doing interpretation on calls that you would like to share?
Not online. I have done a lot of trainings through a live interpreter, but I haven't had an experience online.
What about, let me open that up.
Interestingly, we did this session with Seva in Gujarat, and Shilpa was supposed to be the translator for that. And she's here today. But it so happened that while the participants did not really, they couldn't speak too much of Hindi, they could understand it. So we ended up me delivering it in Hindi, and so the translation, I mean, that opportunity of translation was lost. So I really don't have that experience. Shilpa, you may want to add something to this in case, you know, you've done it in other places or in other sessions.
Yeah, I've done it, not for Seva, but for other places. And I don't know what exactly Esra's point was. I mean, was it for online translation, or was it while you're conducting training online? I've done that live, during live as in somebody has done it when I was conducting online training. And once I had very good experience, and the other time I had terrible experience because it was in Kannada. I had no clue what she was saying. And I could make out that she was possibly missing out on the aspects that I wanted to emphasize on. So, yeah, so I had both types of experiences.
Actually, my question was more to the which tool is more convenient for interpretation. For example, just in my experience, we use Kudo tool. But it was not a very good experience, by the way.
Yeah. Anybody have any tools that they've used? If so, please write them in the chat, and then we can get that answer and continue on. And I see also there's it's a great question. So hopefully some of the people on the call have tools they've used and can share. I see there's also a question from Shital about, with an ideal time of 2 hours per session, what's the ideal duration for a training program? Yeah, it's tricky because you have to do like we're doing here, which is, 8 sessions, and you have to base it, the online, the face-to-face version of this course was originally a 4-day course. And so we had to chop it up a bit more and do it. We're still trying to figure out what that ideal is. And the, obviously shorter is better, but I think you do need a couple of sessions. I would say for, a 1-day in-person class, you're probably going to need 3 2-hour sessions to hit that, if not 4. People obviously have more attention span if it's shorter. But if you really want to give practices to people, then you need it to be longer because you need them to practice online. You need them to come back and be able to give them feedback or practice as homework and, have a feedback discussion afterwards. Rohit, you want to add anything onto that?
No, I think that's okay. But there's also a question from Abdullah on this, on which software and app works, how to know which software and or app works or is supported in a specific country or region.
Well, I think, talk to people around you. I think whatever you're hearing the most in your country is probably the ones that are going to work the best. Personally, I like Zoom. And Zoom is, I believe, pretty much all over the world, although I'm not 100% sure. But I find it to be the easiest out of all of them. The one at the moment I'm liking the least is that I've tried is Microsoft Teams. I'm not a big fan of that. I think it's very clunky. That's just my own personal opinion. There's a ton of them out there. I'm always finding new ones. So I would say just talk with people in your country, in your neighborhood, and see what people are using.
Can I be a bit more clear on it?
Sure.
My question was more about on the policies, because most of the organization that I see in Afghanistan, they have a policy that they only use Google. They're even not allowed to use Microsoft. And then you have the participants that come from the different groups and regions. So then they have difficulties. Are there any clear instructions from IFC that we have to use Zoom so that we can negotiate with them or maybe talk to them, something like that? Or maybe the options that we are talking about in the Zoom may not be available in the Google, or maybe Google is more friendly that we may not have things in this Zoom. So any instructions or guidance on that? Over.
No, thank you for clarifying that. No, there's no guidance from IFC on that. We've tried to make all of our courses to be agnostic, software agnostic, if you will, so that they can work on pretty much anyone. I would say double check for any webinar that you're going to do. If they say we want to do it on Google, go ahead and look on Google, look at your course, see if you can do everything. And if it works, fine. And if not, tell them no. Like I said, I personally, for the more advanced functionality ones, I don't think at the moment Teams is a good one, but we don't say anything about you must use Zoom or anything like that. Okay, well, after you figure out what software you want and the date and all that good stuff, the next thing to organize is your workspace, starting with your camera. Now, imagine that you are attending a different webinar and you see the speaker looking like this. What's wrong with this webinar image? Go ahead and write your answer in the chat. What's wrong with this? It's too bright in the background. Yep, there's bad lighting is the big thing. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a ton of clutter, but look at all that mess behind her. She's looking down, says Kazi. Very good. She's not looking at the audience. There's no drinks. Well, that is a problem, Stephen. Trainer is not properly dressed. That's right. Not dressed up fancy enough, maybe. Absolutely. The goal is to make yourself look as professional, calm, cool, and collected as possible. And this is not that. That's a lot closer to it. Make sure your camera is at eye height or even a little bit above your eyes. The goal is to look directly into the camera or as close to it as possible as you can. So if you feel that you're looking slightly down to see your screen, then lift your screen higher so your eyes look straight ahead. So you might want to take a couple of big fat textbooks and put them under your computer. Right now, I've got about 4 of them under mine. You can take a box and do that. Make sure your lighting is best in front of you or obliquely on the sides. On top is acceptable if the camera is not positioned so it's looking into the light. And at all costs, avoid having light behind you, as it will make the image look very dark. And some of you have very graciously pointed out to me when I'm going too dark, I actually have my window shade drawn, but the sun has been so bright that it's keep causing me problem. So now I'm tilting I'm changing the angle on my computer so that I'm not right in front of the window. Hopefully that's been helping. Look for a clean space and preferably an empty wall. But if you can't find empty, at least try to find a small amount of artwork on the back wall. The goal is to avoid distracting the participants. The more that is happening behind you, the more they look at that instead of you. And finally, wear a solid colored shirt. I don't know if you've noticed this on TV, but video cameras have difficulty with stripes. And if you have on like a thin striped shirt, sometimes the camera makes the lines look like they're dancing. So wear a solid color shirt. And similarly, think about the sound in your environment. Try to find a quiet spot away from children, co-workers, cars, pets, and to further block out noise, use a headset. This will also make your voice sound louder, clearer, and closer than if there is air between you and the computer's microphone. Keep that dial-in number handy in case your microphone is not working correctly. And if you have to use your computer for the visual and your phone for the audio, make sure to mute your computer's microphone and speaker. Otherwise, you're going to hear echoes and feedback. Now, when you're ready to present, remember that time goes much quicker when you are talking than when you are listening. So here are some more tips to help you manage your time. Oh, okay, sorry. Ooh, okay, get there early. First of all, open the webinar at least 40 minutes before the official start of the session. This gives you time to check all the equipment, discuss any issues with your co-host before everyone else joins. Now, start on time. Unless nobody has joined the call yet, begin at the appointed time, because it's not fair to penalize those who made the effort to be on time to accommodate those who did not. And furthermore, you should not punish yourself by putting yourself behind schedule before you even say a word. Leave time for opening remarks. As you plan your session, leave about 10 minutes for opening remarks by the host organization. So if your client, like Serena, wants to say something first, at the beginning of the program, just build that right in. That way you're not behind schedule even before you start to talk. Welcome latecomers, but do not recap. It's tricky here because you want to create a welcoming environment and respectful. And if you have a small group or 1 or 2 people join late, you can acknowledge them briefly and then help orient them. But don't summarize what you just said to the rest of the group, because if you say in 2 minutes what you just told everyone else in 15, everyone else is going to think, why didn't you just say that from the start? And leave time for Q&A. It's really easy to get caught up in your presentation and run long. But if you plan from the beginning to allow 10 to 15 minutes for questions, and you actually leave time in your agenda for it, you're more likely to have that time available. And as you build and practice your webinar, time yourself and check that you are finishing with at least 15 minutes to spare. If you plan on 15, if you run late, you still have 5 or 10 minutes late. Now, think also about what you might need to do if you are working in less than ideal circumstances, like pandemics, emergency situations, or other conflict-related situations. So what else might you need? So right now, we're going to do this in the chat. What additional considerations must you consider when you are facilitating live online learning sessions during pandemics, conflicts, or other emergency situations? What are some of the things you need to think about? Go ahead and write that in the chat. And as you're writing, I will answer Hong's question from earlier about, hey, was that really terrible presenter in that webinar? Was that you, Karen? Yes, that was. My hair was a bit shorter then. It was at the beginning of the pandemic. So what do you think else do you need to consider? Yeah, asking family members to give you a little privacy, right? You know, let them know. Some people put up a sign on the door that says, do not enter, you know, session in progress. That's one thing to keep in mind. Really tricky, especially if you have little kids. Checking the absent ones. All right, find out, you know, are they absent because they just decided not to show up, or because, you know, their internet went down? Have your mini office always ready. What does that mean, Abdullah? Can you open your microphone and share that one? Share a little more.
Yes, Karen, it's about having the like noise, electricity, I mean, the environment, internet, each and everything always ready, as you do for conference room.
Right, exactly. Oh, and Ahmed, thank you. Thank you. Must have backups of your training aids, and not just your training aids, but think about, what are you going to do if your internet goes out, right? Do you have a portable internet hotspot? Or do you know how to use the mobile hotspot on your phone just in case you lose your internet? What are you going to do also? Mostly facing practical issues with electricity failures. We can't overcome that, says Primaceri. Absolutely. So what are you going to do if the power goes out? Well, maybe if the power goes out, you're just going to have a reschedule plan. But maybe you have a backup generator, or sometimes even a battery or a portable battery charger. You could use that. You could plug it in and then use the mobile hotspot on your cell phone with your cell phone battery. That might be able to keep you going. You could also ask the co-host to run it for you. Absolutely. And, you know, whatever you do, make sure if you're hosting, make sure your computer is plugged in, because if the power goes out, at least you've got 2 hours of computer left. Yeah, Shoma says, brief the co-host and give written instructions on the slides. Yeah, what to do, have a cue sheet, absolutely. Also, think about what % of the audience is likely to be joining via mobile phone or via computer. So think about, especially at the beginning, right? Like one day we were all planning to go into work the next day, and so we left our computers at work. And then that night, everybody's like, don't come into the office. And so for the next few days, your computer was not with you. And so if people had to join calls, they had to call it on their phone or on their tablet. Well, if that's the case, first of all, their screens are going to be smaller, but also, if you're planning on having them read something, it may be a little tricky if they're on their phone and they're flipping between talking to you and scrolling through their phone to read something. So think about that too. These are great ideas that you have in mind. Keep the headphones available, absolutely. And Shilpa asks in the in a pandemic or a conflict situation, participants may be tense. Absolutely. How do we build in that sensitivity into our training in the beginning? Absolutely. I think it's perfectly fine. But, you know, again, think about your timing, think about your agenda. You may need to do exactly that. Give them a couple of minutes to vent or to talk about, or, you know, what's been the biggest problem you're having, and let them get that out of their system. But if you're going to do that and you had a 1 hour meeting, you had 1 hour's worth of content, you better find 10 minutes to cut out of there to allow for that. Well, the most important point, and this is right to what Shilpa was saying, is to keep your audience's situation in mind. When you are hosting, bring your patience. Remember, not everyone is comfortable with technology. And especially during times of shelter in place, many participants who are joining the call might not have used technology much before, or might not have ever even attended a webinar. Although I think that's becoming a little less common, but in a lot of emerging areas, that's still the case. So they may be slower to respond and might need more guidance. And some of these people might have, especially in emerging markets, might have trouble reading and have low literacy issues. So that's another reason to use more graphics than words on your slide. Another point to remember is that participants might not be in their normal work situation. You know, they might be dealing with all kinds of new stress, from how do I work and babysit my kids and be the homeschool teacher to them, and, you know, do all this stuff that they've never had to do. So they're pretty stressed out too. So it's really important to be cognizant of this and empathetic of their situation. But don't let it derail your presentation, or it could make you late. Just remember that as you're going through, just keep taking deep breaths and keep smiling a lot. Even if you're feeling frustrated inside, a smile can help you look like you're not annoyed and inspire your listeners' confidence in you. Well, I hope these tips have given you enough new ideas to make you feel a little more capable and confident in your role as webinar facilitators. So we talked about these 4 big topics today. How can I get people to engage more? We talked about how you could use the microphone, the emoticons, and the chats to increase online engagement. We talked about how you could adjust your facilitation style. And we talked about storytelling and vocal modulation. We talked about how you need to adjust your plans to be more online friendly, 2 hours or less, and leave time for those questions. And finally, how to look more professional, keep your camera at eye height, have the lighting in front of you. So I have one more question for you briefly, and that is, you learned a lot today. How are you going to take what you learned in this session and apply it on your job? What are you going to do differently the next time you facilitate a web training session? Go ahead and write an answer in the chat box. Shilpa says she's going to increase the camera height. Good job. Nicola's going to use that presenter mode. It really makes a big difference. Yep, the presenter mode for the longer sessions, absolutely. Mohsen says he's going to have a co-facilitator. Prep the technology better, find ways to minimize the content, says Lily. That's a hard one. So Shilpa said use 2 computers. Yeah, if you can do that, it makes life a lot easier. The picture of the loved one. I really love that. When I first heard that, I was like, that's brilliant. Use more images is probably great. Wonderful. Smile. Yeah. The smile goes a long way. I got to tell you, I was hosting a big family webinar, you know, like a conference call kind of thing for the whole family right at the beginning of this. And people were driving me nuts because they kept talking over each other, and, you know, we couldn't get everything organized, but I just kept smiling as I worked. And a whole bunch of family members afterwards were like, how did you keep your cool through all of that? I was thinking to myself, oh, I was boiling up inside, but I kept smiling. Thank you, Ezra, very much. The whole experience on how you delivered this topic is inspiring. Thank you so much. Well, before I start the final Q&A discussion, let me tell you about your homework. So you're going to have the couple of sheets that you can read. There's a webinar preparation checklist. It's a really great thing to use. I look at mine every time I go on. I sit there and go, yes, yes, yes. There is an engaging participants online tip sheet that you're going to get. And I also want you to pull back out that long practice observation form that you got in session 4. What we're going to ask you to do is, now that you've heard all of this, we want you to apply it. We want you to put it together and prepare a 15-minute live online learning how to training lesson. So what does this mean? We want you to teach us how to do something, not general concepts, not introductions, not, you know, concluding activities, somewhere in the middle of a course. Pick one little topic. You're only going to have 15 minutes to teach us. So don't try to teach us how to play tennis. Just teach us maybe how to serve the ball. That's all we need. But we want you to do the gloss and the ease, do some kind of an activity so you can give feedback, and then do the off. The off is probably just going to be to the next topic. So it's a quick thing. You can use the gloss that you did the last time and adjust it to incorporate the feedback that you got, or to shorten it to make more room for the rest of your lesson. Couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, it's going to be, do this as a live online, so like a webinar, not like a classroom. Number two, consider the 40-60 rule that says at least 6 of the 15 minutes are devoted to the participant actively doing something. And another good rule of thumb is that you spend 20 minutes of the time on the introduction, 70% of the time on the main content, including the activity and the feedback, and then 10% on the conclusion. So that translates, for this activity of 15 minutes, you got about 3 minutes for your gloss introduction. You've got about 10 minutes to teach us something and have us prepare it, practice it, and give us some feedback. And then 2 minutes to do the off. Now, these are guidelines, so if you need to adjust them a little bit, you can. Feel free to use props or visual aids if you want to. You don't have to. Now, the way you're going to do this is, we're going to ask, instead of recording it on your own like you did for the short one, we're going to ask you to get with your groups and teach it to them on your own private little 3-person web conference call. So if you are not the person presenting, you are going to be a participant and actively do whatever your trainer is telling you to do, and make it easy for them, you know, give them a break. This is hard. So 15 minutes for the first person to do their practice and the other 2 people to be the audience. And then take about 5 minutes and give feedback to that presenter on, you know, on, did they follow gloss, ease, off, and feed? Did they follow the TPMA criteria that are in that long practice observation form? And when you give feedback, make sure that you yourself use the feed formula. I like, I noticed, it had the effect, I suggest. That way you practice using feed too. So when you do this recording of this session, when you do this session, record the whole webinar, the entire time. And when you're done, you're going to put up your the link to that webinar on the Google form that Rohit has just put into the chat, and which we will send you afterwards. So it's basically, assume it's going to take about, you know, there's 15 minutes plus 5 minutes is 20 minutes per person times 3 people in your group for most of the groups. So a good hour. So I would say, just to be safe, block a 2-hour time, and you're going to have to organize this a little bit offline with your team members, and you have that WhatsApp group that you can use. What we need Shanaz asks, is it necessary that the feed always has to suggest improvement? If it's, if it's perfect, if they've done something really good, give them positive using feed. But, try to help each other to improve in this. What we need is that you complete that conference call by April 6th, 5 p.m. India, 4:30 Pakistan, 6:30 Vietnam, 7:30 China, 1:30 in Europe, or 7:30 in the morning if you're here in DC, all on April 6th. So that's the time to get it done by. And make sure you put that up. What I would suggest is start thinking about your presentation now. You may want to wait until after session 7 to do the actual session with your teammates, because in session 7, you're going to get some of the additional, you're going to get about the advanced functionality, and you might want to hear about that. Or you might say, you know what, this weekend is the only time we're just going with what we got. Either way is fine. Also, be prepared to answer the questions for when we come together in session 8. In session 8, we're going to ask you what was one thing you learned from the feedback you received from your presentation, and what was one piece of feedback that you gave to someone in the group. So you're going to have to tell everybody what your feed was to somebody else. So what are the groups? Here they are. And again, we will send this out. Oops, that's not the right group. Why is that not right? Okay, we will send you the groups. Shoma, you're actually going to be in group 5, and Kazi, I believe you're in group 1. If you look at that link that Rohit put in the chat, we've also put the correct groupings in there. So there's actually 6 groups, and I apologize. I thought I had saved that. There isn't a lot of time. I agree, Stephen. Oops. There's not a lot of time between session 7 and session 8, but there still is some time. So start thinking about it now. This isn't due until 2 days before session 8. And we asked for it a little bit before because we want to try, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to watch every one of these videos and give every one of you feedback using that long practice form. So we need time to review it too. And that's why we're asking it be shorter.
I have a question, Karen.
Yeah, hold on a second. There's one from Shilpa, and then we'll take Esra. Can we have the same groups with whom we did the gloss? We wanted to mix it up a little. Some of you are going to be the same, some of you are different, because we wanted you to get different feedback and, have a chance to get more perspective from, get more of a 360-degree thing. So we just wanted to let you hear from other people. Esra, what was your question?
I just wonder about the content. Is it something that teaching, as you said, teaching something, or can it be the continuation of what I did in the gloss?
It can be the continuation of what you did in the gloss, but just make sure that you're teaching us how to do something. So there has to be some kind of like a practice aspect of it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Well, we've only got we're a tiny bit over time, but if you want to ask more questions either about the homework or anything else, I'm willing to stay on for a little bit longer. My apologies for running about 4 minutes late. We had some really great questions throughout this, so I appreciate all of those. You can do your session in any topic you want. It can be work related, it can be how to tie your shoe, anything in between. But they should all be for online presentation. Yes, do not think of this as a classroom one. Think of this as a web classroom one.
Ahmed had a question that should all the participants be online for the presentation?
Yes, because all the people in your group should be online so that you can use them as your audience for the activities. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if not, I hope you have a good weekend. I understand it's a long weekend in some countries. For those of you who, can the role play be an activity? Absolutely. Yeah, just have the two people be doing the role play. That's totally acceptable.
I think Ahmed also has a follow-up question. Ahmed, I think you're confused. You don't need to have all 20 participants online, only the ones in your group. So you can fix up a convenient time between the 3 or 4 of you and get together.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Great, good question.
Sorry,
And
one last question. Are you going to post the group composition on the handouts?
Yeah, we'll send that to you too.
All right, great. Thank you.
Or if you just click on the link that I've posted a little while back, or let me just post it again. On that, the groups are also given in the Google Doc.
All right. And is this link going to be on the handouts also, Rohit?
Sarina's already mailed it to you, I think.
Great, thank you.
And if she hasn't, she'll mail it afterwards.
I have a question. Can you just clarify when you say that in the training you have to teach something or you have to make them practice something? What exactly do you mean by that?
What I mean is I don't want you to do an icebreaker activity or a review activity. And for sure, I don't want you to do a lecture the entire time.
Okay.
Doing like a how to do something is a little bit easier for, to conceptualize this.
Okay, thanks.
And you said, Karen, it's okay to do the same topics we started with the gloss. We could use that.
Absolutely. And if you want to tweak your gloss now that you've gotten some feedback, you can do that too.
All right, great. Thank you.
Premasri is asking if they can do it to the actual target group.
Yeah, so you can tell the people in your group, imagine you are a group of farmers and this is from the middle of a class on how to do crop rotation. You can set the stage for them. And then your participants will just pretend to be those people. So I think it's always a good idea. Remember, this is coming from the middle of the class, so you don't have to waste time doing ground rules or doing introductions of everybody. Just pretend that's already happened. But I think it is good before your presentation officially begins, and make sure that you appoint somebody a timekeeper so that you keep it to 15 minutes. I mean, that's really important. The timing is critical. But I would also suggest that you just take a moment before those 15 minutes begin to say, this is who you are. You're women entrepreneurs. This is a class on marketing your small to medium enterprise, whatever. And you've already had